This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson Podcast.
Before we go back into everything that Randall was talking about last week, we wanted to mention a few things about the Anzick site.
Yeah, so I have a mea culpa. I talked about some details last time that I was inaccurate about.
Not unusual.
Yeah, totally normal for me.
Kind of our job.
So I talked about the excavation of the site, and I was confusing it with another story about I think it was a Neanderthal excavation. So the doing more research on the Anzick site, discovered some information I didn't know previously, which was that the site was actually originally discovered by some workers who were using heavy equipment and digging in the site with a front end loader. They started to see artifacts, stone artifacts and such, and so they got off the equipment and they hand dug the site and removed a bunch of Clovis artifacts and the skeletal remains of Anzick-1. And that was in 1968. And so shortly thereafter, a guy, an actual archaeologist, went and looked at the site. And I'm going to read this quick thing that he said. And this, I'm still trying to look for this actual report, but I got this from a site called Genetiker. I've also seen it referenced, this paper referenced on multiple other sites, so I'm kind of trusting this source at the moment. It says, later in 1968, the site was professionally investigated by D. Taylor of the University of Montana. In his report titled The Wilsall Excavations, An Exercise in Frustration, Taylor wrote, unfortunately, the Wilsall or Anzick material was unearthed in such a way that the data from several levels could have become thoroughly mixed. It is unfortunate, too, that our amateur diggers were so thorough and succeeded in finding almost everything that was there, leaving nothing in situ. The potential importance of the site cannot be overemphasized. Had it been possible to make a definite association of the human bones with Clovis materials, it would have given archaeologists their first glimpse of the actual bones of one of these ancient hunters. So what happened later, and I think this is in 2007, let's see, this is, there's a paper on the Anzick-1. I downloaded, I think this is Oxford. Lorena Becerra Valdivia, Michael R. Waters, says, reassessing the chronology of the archaeological site of Anzick. And so what they did is they went back in and they did extensive, exhaustive radiocarbon dating on the fragments of the skeletal fragments, the bones. There were also some antler bones that were found, and they dated many of these, and they were basically, what they're trying to say in this paper is that the antler bones, which do date to the Clovis era, are very closely, like they're trying to say that the skeletal remains, many of the dates that they got, and the antler bones are sort of coeval in this site with all of these Clovis artifacts. So they're bolstering the idea that the skeletal remains are Clovis, even though the dates were somewhat later than Clovis, the Clovis time period. So it's a controversial issue. There's a lot of arguing back and forth. I'm personally, like, my bias is that I'm like, I don't know, this is dubious, the way it was dug up and everything. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from, but I still want to do a deeper dive into the material to really try to understand it better.
Yeah, because that, if it was Clovis, I'm guessing that represents pretty much our only, other than the woman that was found on the Channel Islands. We should probably come back and take a closer look at that.
Yeah, I'm unfamiliar with that. So
we have discussed that on our podcast, the girl that was found on the Channel Islands.
Yeah.
I just don't know much about it. So
that was a very interesting case. I agree that was.
Yeah. Well,
a lot of people think that whole thing is a hoax now. It's so strange.
What, the Anzick thing?
That the Channel Islands,
oh,
a
the
lot of people think that whole thing is controversial. Yeah, it's also controversial because of the same thing. It's so old and changes a lot of, yeah.
But it is interesting too that one of the other points was that the bone fragments, there were two different, there was another cranial fragments of another skeleton at the same site that was unrelated, Anzick-2. It was a little later date. But they say that the Anzick bones, Anzick-1, and the antlers, and I guess the artifacts, from what I understood, and I could be wrong about this, but I thought it was saying the artifacts as well were covered in red ochre, which is strange. You know, all of the bone fragments covered in red ochre. This looks like a burial practice. If you can imagine that maybe they waited until the bones were just bones, and then they painted them in red ochre and then buried them or something.
Yeah,
so
that red ochre on the bones, that would have to be how they did it. Yeah.
So I don't know. It's really interesting.
So then the question becomes, how is this may not be possible to resolve with carbon dating, but is the red ochre younger than the bones? I mean, if somebody found it way later and then painted them, so I don't know. But if it seems weird that you would paint the artifacts as well and the antler, I don't know.
So now we determined that the radiocarbon dates were coming up right at 10,600. Is that what?
For the Anzick-1 skeleton, I think that's right.
For Anzick-1.
Yeah, Kyle's pulling it up.
Which then would imply somewhere roughly 12,600 calibrated years. But I mean, there could be, which then puts it, a couple of hundred years anyway after the Younger Dryas boundary.
Right.
Which, if that was the case, then implies that the bones were of someone that survived the Younger Dryas boundary. Or was it someone who succumbed at the Younger Dryas boundary? And again, I don't know how accurate, what is the plus or minus on those dates?
Okay, so let me just read this. This is, first of all, Willerslev. I'm not sure who this is the one of the authors on the paper, Willerslev.
Okay.
Says in the very first sentences are the only known Clovis burial and associated mortuary assemblage was found in the Americas at the Anzick site, Montana, in 1968. Here, approximately 100 stone tools and 15 osseous tool fragments that are technologically consistent with the artifacts of the Clovis complex were found in direct association with the partial fragmentary remains of an infant child, Anzick-1. The human remains were found directly below the Clovis artifacts and were covered with red ochre. Bone from the skeleton was directly dated using XAD collagen to 10,705 plus or minus 35, and that's 14C, so that's carbon 14 years before present, or 12,707 to 12,556 calendar years before present, close to the end of the Clovis time period.
Well, okay, so that's interesting because 12,707, you said?
Yes.
And what was the plus minus on that?
Well, it says 12,556. The plus minus
is factored in. Okay, I see that.
Yeah.
Well, let's say it's at the older date, close to 12.7. Well, that means that it's coming almost right on the heels of the Younger Dryas boundary.
Yeah.
It means it's come after the black mat. It means it's come after the platinum layer in the ice core. Maybe a century or 2 centuries, somewhere in there, after those two chronostratigraphic markers. So it's interesting. I don't know what to conclude from it, other than if those dates are correct, then that would have been obviously an infant, so it would have been born to somebody who had maybe not themselves survived the events of the Younger Dryas boundary, the deposition of the platinum, which coincides pretty much with the black mat layer, the deposition of the microspherules, the magnetic grains that we've been talking about. But it would have been somebody who is descended from, only a few generations removed from somebody who did survive that.
Yes.
Now, or is it, somebody who came in Yeah, I mean, it's very curious. And of course, it brings us again to the whole question of why are the remains of the Clovis so conspicuous by their absence?
Right.
Yeah. And I would just have to say, in looking deeper into this, this is another one of those things, like what you have done with the, going through all of this information on the Younger Dryas, going from paper to paper and the arguments back and forth. I mean, this is clearly going on here. At this one site that I've found, this guy is referencing all of these arguments. There's different papers from different years and people saying this and that. And it's going to take some serious digging to really kind of lay this out.
And what makes it frustrating sometimes is that you see that there's all this argument happening in the background, and that the scientists know that the people that really are doing the science on this know that it's up in the air. But anybody who there's not a lot of people, but when I see Anzick referenced in, by people who aren't really looking into it, they think it's a Clovis person. That's what's given out by the science writers of the mainstream, that this is a Clovis person, and they're also genetically related, and it's made cut and dry until you start digging into it, just like a lot of the stuff that you point out.
And then there's a lot of controversy.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's interesting, but I don't think we have enough information to come to any kind of resolution of the problem. So, it's worth it to probably check back in from time to time to see what, if there's new evidence that's come forward, or, I'm very interested to see if again, I mean, the whole idea of what happened to the Clovis people, where did they go? Why do we not find burials? That's to me a very interesting question. And so anything that might shed light on that, I think, is valuable. Because here was the culture that occupied North America right up to the very end of the Pleistocene.